So regarding the Air India 171 crash, the Air India Civil Aviation Authority has now ordered inspections of those fuel switches that are located right below the throttle in a normal aircraft. In the Phenom, they're located a little bit further down and sort of off of a flat panel, a little bit below the throttle controls in the Boeing 737 and the 787 aircraft. And now India is flipping, saying, hey, we need to actually inspect these fuel switches on these aircraft following that deadly crash that killed nearly 300 people in India last month, as all of a sudden those fuel supply switches were cut off. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, because in 2018, Air India suggested we don't need to inspect the potential failure of these fuel switches because we just received an advisory notification from the FAA, and that's not enough for us to actually want to do anything. Now, why would they not do anything then? Well, as usual, probably because of money. See, here's the preliminary report where we could see, per the information from Air India, suggested inspections were not carried out in the advisory bulletin, since the bulletin was advisory and not mandatory, despite reports that fuel switches in Model 737 airplanes, which had very similar fuel control switches to the 787-8 Dreamliner that crashed in India. Despite that, Air India did not conduct any inspections to verify that the locking mechanism was functional for these switches. Note, even if that locking mechanism was not functional, the switches could still work, unfortunately, until you have an accidental knock into these switches via turbulence or, who knows, maybe an intentional switch off of those switches. We don't like to think about that, but it's always a possibility. That said, Air India is now not the only one who's following this. Etihad, South Korea, Singapore, they're all forcing now, quote, mandatory checks on the fuel control switches of Boeing airplanes in India. So all of these various different airlines are mandating this following the Air India crash and referencing that 2018 advisory. To me, this is a little bit of a sign that what you're finding is companies are starting to realize, crap, maybe we should comply with this information bulletin, and maybe we should go inspect all of our planes. Even though we didn't do it in 2018, now here we are 7 years later, and oopsie doopsies, almost 300 people lost their lives because we decided not to follow an advisory notice. Now, some people point the finger at the FAA and say, hey, well, it's the FAA's fault. This should have been a mandatory requirement. Problem is, usually mandatory updates, they don't come out of maybe the switches are broken. It often takes oopsies like what we saw in India to actually convince movement towards you must make these changes. And why again? Because of money. Why, for something that could happen, spend money? It's unfortunate to think that way, but unfortunately that's sometimes the way lobbying in big business can work. But to me, this is kind of a little bit of a slap in the face to Boeing that they should wake up. And when there are these advisory notices, potentially Boeing encourage mandatory notices to the airlines using their aircraft. It is good, though, seeing that not only is Air India requiring air carriers to conduct these inspections, but you're seeing other countries get involved in this as well, because certainly we don't want to see these fuel supply switches cut off again, especially if indeed they were an accident. And since this has been flagged as an issue in the past where these switches could accidentally be turned off, now all of a sudden regulators are going, oh wow, this is actually a problem that we should be paying attention to. Now the note here, Bloomberg, who's also covering the story, says that the Directorate of General Civil Aviation has asked operators to complete the inspections within a week to ensure continued airworthiness and safety of operations. The report published last week revealed that the fuel supply switches on the doomed 787 were turned off immediately after the plane took off. And the pilots reversed that roughly about 10 seconds later, unfortunately proving too late. And we saw this. Again, we don't know if this was intentional or accidental. Blanco Liria had this fantastic perspective, I should call it, that potentially turbulence led to the bumping into these switches through either the guarding of the throttles or something falling on them during rotation or whatever. It's entirely who knows, maybe they had a GoPro that was filming or something, and it during the rotation fell down and hit those switches. I'm totally speculating on that. The point is something could have fallen, somebody's hand could have hit it, whatever. It could have theoretically been accidental. And if this is indeed exactly what was warned in 2018 as what could happen, well, then we can see that even advisory bulletins could be life-saving critical, or in this case, life-losing. Air India's executive officer Campbell Wilson said in a memo to employees on Monday that the report provided both greater clarity and opened additional questions. This is true. More questions remain now because it's, well, what would have knocked into the switches? Again, elbow, arm, hand, device, coffee cup, who knows? This is why so many people are calling for, hey, we've got cameras in semi-trucks, why don't we have cameras in planes? We speculated on that yesterday and explained why not only the aviation lobby, pilots, the oversight the FAA has over pilots and aircraft behavior, whatever, the potential leaking of footage, who knows? These are all things we talked about yesterday. But we're also hearing here that several Middle Eastern airlines have also started inspecting their Boeing fleets. I would imagine it's just a matter of time before we start doing this in the United States as well. Hopefully, knock on wood. I highly encourage these inspections in the United States as well. Oman Air has completed checks on fuel switches for around a dozen 787s so far and is now inspecting 737s in its fleet, while Saudi is checking its jets and said it complied with all of Boeing's recommendations. Jordan's national air carrier completed a visual check of the fuel switches in the 787 in its fleet. Visual check. I feel like you need to actually operate the fuel switch to know if it's going to work. But I think what they're looking for is that little tab, a little metal tab to make sure the locking mechanism is present. But I would certainly encourage actually operating the switch to make sure that it locks in place. And I mean, we've seen this before. If you haven't seen it yet, this is roughly what those switches look like. You can see this individual is pushing down on the switches. The switches don't go down. They don't go down until they get lifted to get essentially pushed over the little gate that blocks it. Pretty sad to think something so basic could end up leading to such a disaster, but that is an update that's now out from and on the Air India crisis. It's also worth noting, will we actually have an answer in terms of what turned them off? We may never know. That's unfortunate. Here, for example, is the Etihad letter indicating that there will be an inspection of the fuel control switch locking mechanism. But it is possible that we just may never know what actually ended up switching these switches off, which is terrible because, again, it just leaves more questions than answers. But I do think at minimum inspecting all of these on all the potentially affected Boeings, critical first step, and I'm glad to see we're doing it.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.